the affidavit, according to Jenkins, was wrong, had a mistake in it. That shouldn't even have been in the affidavit, Chris. It doesn't give them any. Why would they even put that in the affidavit? They didn't have that information at the time. That shouldn't even have been in there for probable cause.
Welcome back, everyone. 3 years after the University of Idaho murders left 4 college students dead, the case continues to capture national attention. Investigators arrested and charged Bryan Kohberger, prosecutors pointing to DNA and digital evidence as key pieces of the case. Well, now there's a new book, Broken Plea, the explosive search for truth behind the Idaho murders. It takes a fresh look at the investigation, raising questions about the evidence and introducing details never before presented to the public.
It's been more than 9 months since quadruple murderer Bryan Kohberger was sentenced to 4 life prison terms with no chance of parole after taking a surprise guilty plea in a deal with prosecutors. It was all in the gruesome 2022 stabbing deaths of 4 Idaho college students. The plea deal allowed Kohberger to avoid a lengthy murder trial and remove the possibility of the death penalty. But now new questions have arisen about key prosecution evidence and whether that evidence would have held up in court had the case gone to trial. For example, the knife sheath that was found at the crime scene. In his book, Broken Plea, author Christopher Whitcomb spotlights that key piece of evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti. Can I be your superhero?
Welcome to the revealing, folks. Old Pav's having one of those tinfoil hat moments this morning, and just thinking out loud in this one, I'm going to tell you what I've just been contemplating, show you some of the evidence around why I've contemplated it, and then I'll ask for your opinion at the end. It seems sometimes when I just take everything that I know about certain situations and I begin plugging them on a timeline just to see if I can see a pattern, almost always something appears that seems like it's just not a coincidence for that type of pattern. So I put together a little timeline right here, and I'm just going to kind of go through this with you. We've got November 13th, 2022, which of course was the night of the atrocity. And then I'm going to fast forward to November 16th, 2022, because that's when the Idaho State Police Lab receives the knife sheath for the first time. Then we'll skip ahead to November 20th, 2022, because that is when the DNA that was gathered from the knife sheath was entered into CODIS, and the decision was made to send it to Othram Labs for investigative genetic genealogy. Then December 10th, the FBI takes over the IgG according to the documents from Othram Labs and continues work on it. And then on December 19th, the FBI provides Bryan Kohberger's name to Moscow Police Department as a tip in the investigation, and they say it's due to the use of the IgG. Fast forward to December 30th, Bryan Kohberger is arrested. Fast forward to January 23rd, 2025, Bryan Kohberger pleads guilty and is sentenced to 4 life terms in prison. But then we fast forward to today, April 28th, 2026, now. And after today, the next important date in this scenario we've identified as September 3rd, 2026, the deadline for Bryan Kohberger to file for post-conviction relief. And that's only 4 months away. So right now it's getting really close to that deadline. If something was going to happen, it would be happening between now and that deadline. So I find this to be kind of interesting when I look at all this. And here's why. Because from this area right here, November 20th through December 19th, this is when we had a lot of involvement from the FBI in this case. This is the time frame where the FBI was involved with the IGG investigation that they're so proud of that they're now using in a lot of cases. This is also the time frame where the FBI was involved with likely the phone pings, even though that may have came just a little bit after on the 23rd. A lot of us believe it happened before the 23rd, before Brett Payne actually got that warrant. But we'll just kind of leave it at that for now. And then there is the FBI involvement in identifying suspect vehicle. It all happens during this time frame. And these are the three main things that the FBI's involvement was going to really provide some testimony for at trial. As we all know, they had the FBI agents set up to testify in their various roles, not including IGG. That was going to be hidden from everything due to a suppression by Judge Hippler to just say it was a tip. But I believe that at trial, if certain things happen, that certainly would have come out. And obviously in the future with post-conviction relief, there's a lot that could come out about the IGG. So when I look at all this and I see this part, and we know that that is the whole case against Bryan Kohberger. I've heard it referred to many times as a three-pronged case. The DNA, the phone pings, and suspect vehicle.
The three-pillar offense, right? DNA, the white car, and the cell tower DNA. The cell tower analysis, the pings. That was the prosecution.
And when I hear that, then I start thinking, what was the FBI involved in this case? They had big time involvement in the DNA because of their employment of the investigative genetic genealogy. They were the main source for the phone pings, and they were the absolute source on the identification of suspect vehicles. So all three of those major things the FBI was set to testify for at trial. But knowing now what we didn't know then, it makes me question this, because when we look at the FBI's involvement and what they did in the three pillars, I think about the first one, which is suspect vehicle identification. And considering that they do thousands of cases where they testify about identification of vehicles from video, and then in this case, we look at a video that they say they identified the make and model of a vehicle from, two videos actually, and then when we get the release video, we notice that they both have fog lamps, and Bryan Kohberger's car doesn't. So that means the FBI identified a vehicle that had a feature that was very apparent to not be part of Bryan Kohberger's car. And it doesn't stop there. The next video that they claimed was Bryan Kohberger's car, we identify it through its release video to have a fog light as well. So once again, it's pretty easy for us to determine that it's not his car. Why wasn't it easy for the FBI with all their software and experience to determine it? Then we slow down the video in the King Road neighborhood and we get a shot of the rear of the vehicle that is actually circling. And turns out it's not an Elantra either. So the most important part, though, is the discrepancy in the official FBI comprehensive report of movements of suspect vehicle, where they identify each timestamp in a progression and they note it in their official stamped report, and this is what they would be testifying to. The problem is, as the progression goes from one camera at 326 to the next camera at 328 to the next camera at 329, they note that the timestamp accuracy is off on this camera in their notes, and we need to add 1 minute and 43 seconds. So we didn't know if that 1 minute and 43 seconds had already been added or if we needed to add it until we got the actual video released. And to our shock, the timestamp on the video that was released was actually 3:27:46, which told us that we needed to add 1 minute and 43 seconds, which made this time 3:29:29. So we didn't know where this 3:28:56 came from. This should have either said 3:27:46 and then we add the time to it to make it 3:29:29, or it should have just said 3:29:29. And the problem with that is 326, 329.29, 329.02. That would have the vehicle actually doing some, some back to the future from this camera to this camera. It can't go back in time 30 seconds. And then we questioned our own brains on this and said, are we thinking about this wrong? Then a supplemental response comes out and they double down and actually put the timestamp in their response of 3:27:46, which we see on the camera. And below it, they tell us to add 1 minute and 43 seconds to it. And I'll be darned if it doesn't equal 3:29:29. So this was the worst math error ever by the FBI in a comprehensive report, which proves it wasn't the vehicle, or it was a lie. Either way, very embarrassing for the FBI as it relates to everything around their work on suspect vehicle. I don't think they would want the entire public to be aware of this and have news stations reporting on it because of all the work they do in cases. Very embarrassing. Then there's the second prong of the prosecution's case, the tower pings. Well, we know Kohberger's phone was off between 254 and 248 that night, so there aren't any tower pings during that time, which means the most they can say with the tower in Pullman and the tower in Moscow is Kohberger was south of Pullman at 254 and somewhere down south at 448, neither one putting him anywhere near the King Road neighborhood. So that was a nothing burger in itself altogether. But then there is the ultimate, the family tree experiment that the FBI participated in, where the odds of this are astronomical against, it's almost laughable at this point, because they took, if you follow the progression, the investigative genetic genealogy, their new golden ticket to solving crimes. And they took a piece of evidence from the crime scene, which was identified as a brand new K-bar knife sheath that a minuscule sample of touch DNA was extracted from it. And they decide to send it to their investigative genetic genealogy company they work with, Othram Labs, and have them create a genetic profile. And then take that genetic profile and take all the genetics of the entire world's population and remove them. Start narrowing them down from everybody in the world to everybody in America, and then narrow them down even further. Just the genetics of a specific family tree. And that specific family tree just happens to be in the greater Pennsylvania area. So they removed the genetics from everybody in the world down to just this little small geographic area in Pennsylvania. And then lo and behold, we find out that that K-bar knife factory that produced the K-bar sheath and would have last touched that brand new sheath just happens to be located right in the middle of this tiny geographic area. So a brand new sheath, you take out all the genetics on some touch DNA, you build a family tree, and it leads you right back to the K-bar factory. The odds makers at the gambling sites would give this, I'm sure, a betting odds of around 1 in an octillion, or let me say it better, an octillion to 1, which means the odds of this actually not being a factory worker is about 1 in an octillion. You bet $1, and if it's not one of the factory workers, you win an octillion dollars. That's how bad the odds would be on this. So embarrassing, the FBI wasn't able to continue using their gold standard IgG silver bullet. So it brings me back to this timeline and where all this stuff happened with the FBI's involvement in those 3 main pillars of the case, the actual evidence that they were going to use against Bryan Kohberger and the times that all this stuff really took place for the FBI. They're set to testify. And then we move all the way to today, April 28, 2026, just 4 months shy of the post-conviction relief deadline. And then I start thinking, wait a minute, what about the current status of the documents in the Kohberger case? Is there anything around that that tells me that maybe there is something brewing about post-conviction relief filings? And I just start making another timeline. I go, okay, well, Kohberger was sentenced on July 23rd, 2025. And then I start going through the judge's unsealing order of documents. And I see that the first order he issued was on August 4th, 2025, declaring an outline for how he was going to unseal the documents. And then the first unsealing was on September 3rd. And he unsealed some documents. And then the second unsealing happened October 9th, just a little over a month later. And then he unsealed those documents. And the next unsealing happened December 18th, 2025. Now, unfortunately, we're still not even halfway through the 2025 documents. We still got the rest of those, 2024, 2023, even 2022. So all of a sudden, though, we see this gap between December 18th, 2025, the last unsealing, and all the way to today, almost 5 months later, and still nothing. So a little over a month and a half, 5 months and nothing. I think that's a big red flag, because as of April 28, 2026, the judge still hasn't issued the next order to unseal that stuff that we're wanting to see. But don't worry, because today is the official release of a new book by an ex-FBI agent that is going to give us access to a lot of these unsealed facts that the judge won't unseal.
Well, now is a new book, Broken Plea, the explosive search for truth behind the Idaho murders. It takes a fresh look at the investigation, raising questions about the evidence and introducing details never before presented to the public.
If that isn't a mind-boggler, I can't even explain it. So I've noticed the conversation, though, with all of the interviews that are happening, and for some reason, the evidence and the conversations around certain things don't pertain to what I would hope to hear. I don't hear any talk about what they did with unknown male A, blood on the handrail, unknown male D, verified blood on the glove, neither one being Bryan Kohberger's. But more importantly, I don't hear anybody talking about anything about the L5 fingerprint, which was the bloody fingerprint on the rear sliding door.
Here with us now is the author and former FBI agent, Chris Whitcomb. Chris, welcome to the show. I have a copy of your book. I look forward to reading it. You have poured through court records and investigative files that have not been seen by the public yet. One of the most serious questions you raised in the new book, and this is interesting, is whether the murders could have involved more than one person. What's the analysis that led you to rethink that question, whether the convicted killer, Bryan Kohberger, acted alone?
The number one thing I believe, looking holistically at the book and looking at the case, you have three discrete crime scenes within the house itself. One is the third floor bedroom, where we know now that Maddie and Kaylee were killed, and the second floor bedroom where Xana and Ethan were killed. There's a space between. The killer had to go from the third floor, down the stairs, through the living room, down a hallway, into that bedroom. And in doing so, the killer tracked a good deal of blood from one space to the other. When I looked at the evidence and the police report, and the prosecution hired a woman named Paulette Sutton to do a forensic analysis for the prosecution that would have been used at trial. And it showed one thing that really stood out to me, that all of the blood evidence, and there was a significant amount between the third floor bedroom and the second floor bedroom, was quote unquote diluted with an unknown substance.
That they made appear using amido black. Now, some people will say that's not blood, it's chicken grease. Okay, well, I can tell you that they lifted about 40 actual latent prints from the house, and they dedicated 2 forensic reports to all of those prints. This particular print, though, that they had to use amido black to get, they actually investigated more than any other piece of evidence in this case, and I went back through and verified it. Just the L5 fingerprint alone, they dedicated 17 forensic reports to the investigation and exclusion of people for the L5 fingerprint. Just in comparison, so you know, there was 48 total forensic reports issued in this case. That means the entire case, the Idaho State Police Forensic Services, of the 48 total reports they issued on evidence that was processed, 17 of them were for L5. 2 of the ISP-D2 reports, there was 4 total, 2 of those were dedicated to L5. And then in the other reports for the main case, you had report 5, 10, 11, 12, 19, 21, 24, 27, 32, 37, 39, 40, 41, 43, and 44, and we don't know what 42 says, but that's 17 reports, all that work, like almost 40% of the casework in this case by the Idaho State Police Forensic Lab was dedicated to the L5 fingerprint. So tell me that wasn't the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case, and we know that Bryan Kohberger is excluded from that print. So why is this not the main topic out there when we're talking to especially the mainstream morons? But it's not. So again, when I look at all this, and it seems like there's been a pause in the judge unsealing things all the way through today, but don't worry, we've got a new book that's unsealing things and creating a lot of discussion in the case. Even the mainstream morons are having interviews, having discussions. There's a lot of articles out there about this. And it takes me all the way back to the main timeline. Again, as we go through the time of events in this case, all the way up until now, April 28th, the new book with all the information that we can't look at because the judge won't unseal it, just happens to come out 4 months prior to the deadline for post-conviction relief. So if Kohberger or his team was going to file something,
I still feel like, depending on how the Dateline leak investigation comes out, because I don't think we've heard the last of that. God only knows what happens. I just feel like we haven't heard the last of this. I could be wrong. You know, there could be a habeas petition. I just don't know.
it's only a few months away before they file it, and all of that stuff I just discussed with the FBI's embarrassment would be put on blast for everybody to see. So how could they do a preemptive strike? This is how I think about things.
But now new questions have arisen about key prosecution evidence and whether that evidence would have held up in court had the case gone to trial. For example, the knife sheath that was found at the crime scene. In his book, Broken Plea, author Christopher Whitcomb spotlights that key piece of evidence. Whitcomb says that chain of custody issue around that knife sheath was a problem, and it could have led to that being thrown out of court.
The main thing that's being discussed in all of the interviews, that's all the focus is being put on right now, is the chain of custody on the knife sheath and how the sticker was likely forged and there's not a proper chain of custody and the knife sheath itself should be thrown out. And when I think about that, I go, well, that's wonderful. That would absolutely free Bryan Kohberger, because if you throw out the chain of custody on the knife sheath and you throw out the knife sheath, then that's fruit of the poisonous tree. Because without the knife sheath itself, they can't extract the DNA from the knife sheath, which means they can't match it to the buccal swab, which means they can't do the IgG investigation, which means they wouldn't have got Bryan Kohberger's name from the IgG investigation. So the FBI could not have provided it to Moscow PD as a tip, which means Bryan Kohberger would have never been identified in this investigation. Case closed, Bryan Kohberger's released. All of that stuff that would have embarrassed the FBI is swept under the rug. And then I look at this, because that scenario that I just described would stop everything around the evidence of that sheath as soon as the lab gets it and that chain of custody form was forged on November 16th. That's before they process the DNA. That's before they send it to the FBI for the IgG. And that's before they identify Kohberger as a suspect, which means they wouldn't have his phone pings, and they would have never identified suspect vehicle as being Bryan Kohberger's without them first finding him through the IgG. It's a way to keep all of this out of the public's eye and make this case go away and have everybody in the world still question, was Kohberger really the one? That is the scary part of this. So while I'm thinking all this out, and again, I'm tinfoil hatting this stuff, and I'm probably thinking of the worst possible scenario when it's not the worst possible scenario. It's probably just how things go, and it's wonderful that all this new attention's being brought to the case, and we can finally get the eyes on it that we need. I just can't help but think that things are just kind of laying out a little bit too perfect. But please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because I really need them in this one. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti and his tinfoil hat is out.